The morning of the auction, there were 300 hens nobody wanted. They stood in stacked wire crates behind the livestock barn at the Hadley County Fairgrounds, feathers thin along their backs, combs gone pale, the smell of them sharp in the damp October air. The auctioneer had already passed over their lot twice, working through goats and a pair of lame steers and a trailer of rabbits before circling back, almost apologetic, to the spent layers a commercial outfit had dumped at cost because the truck into the rendering plant would have run higher than what the birds were worth dead. A man in a feed store cap leaned on the rail and said loud enough for half the barn to hear that the only thing those chickens were good for was teaching a dog to point, and the men around him laughed the easy laugh of people who had said the same kind of thing many times before. The bidding opened at $1 and stalled. The auctioneer dropped it to 50 cents a crate, then to a flat price for the whole lot, and still the room sat on its hands, because everyone in that barn understood what a hen looked like at the end of her commercial life. And these hens looked worse than that. They looked finished. That was when the young woman in the back, in a canvas jacket 2 sizes too big and boots that had belonged to somebody else first, raised one finger and offered $15 for the lot. The auctioneer paused, looked at her, looked around for a counter that did not come, and brought the gavel down with the small relief of a man glad to be rid of a problem. The feed store cap turned to his neighbor and said, plain as weather, that she had just paid $15 for the privilege of digging 300 holes. The neighbor laughed. The young woman, whose name was Della Reyes, and who had come home to Hadley County 11 weeks earlier without a plan she could have named out loud, did not look at either of them. She was already walking toward the crates, counting in her head, watching the birds breathe. If you are still with me this early, do me one small favor before we go any further. Tap the like button so this story finds the people who need it, and drop the name of your town or city in the comments so I know where you're listening from tonight. I read every one of them, and there is something quiet and good about seeing a map of strangers gathered around the same fire. Now let us begin. Della was 23 years old that autumn, and she had been back in Hadley County for the better part of 3 months, which was long enough for the gossip about her to have curdled into something the town considered settled. She had enlisted at 18, the week after graduation, and she had served 6 years as a vehicle mechanic on a base in Georgia and another in Germany. And she had come home not because she had been told to, and not because she had failed at anything, but because her grandfather had died in February, and the small farm at the end of Polecat Hollow Road had been left to her in a will so short it fit on a single page. Her mother lived in Tulsa now with a second husband and a job at a hospital, and her older brother had moved to Charlotte for a sales position he liked talking about, and neither of them wanted the 83 acres of pasture and ridge and the leaning barn and the white house with the porch that sagged on the east side. So the farm came to Della, who had spent every summer of her childhood there, and who had been the one to sit with her grandfather in the last week and listen to him say almost nothing while the rain ran down the windows. She had separated from the army in August. She had driven home in a 15-year-old pickup with a tool chest in the bed and a duffel on the passenger seat. She had walked through the empty house and stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the light. People in town assumed she would sell. People in town assumed wrong. The first thing she did was clean the gutters. The second thing she did was sit on the porch with a notebook and write down in her even small handwriting every structure on the property and what condition it was in. And then she wrote down what her grandfather had grown there in the years she remembered, and then she wrote down, at the bottom of the page, the single word eggs, and underlined it twice, because of something her great-aunt Merle had said the day after the funeral, almost in passing, while wiping down a counter that did not need wiping. Merle was 81 and lived in a double-wide on the back corner of the property, which her brother had set up for her 30 years earlier, when her own husband died and she had nowhere convenient to go. She wore men's work pants and a flannel shirt and rubber boots almost every day of the year, and she wore them without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. She had kept chickens on that farm since before Della was born. Not many, never more than 50 at a time, but the eggs from Merle's hens had been spoken of in the hollow for as long as anyone could remember, the way certain tomatoes or certain apples get spoken of in places where people still pay attention to the difference. Merle did not sell them commercially. She traded them mostly to a handful of neighbors and to the diner in town that her cousin's daughter had run until it closed in 2019. And what she did not trade she ate or gave to the hounds. The morning after the funeral, Della had asked her, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee neither of them was really drinking, what made the eggs from her hens different. And Merle had looked at her for a long beat, the way she looked at most questions, and had said only that it was the breed and the ground and the time, and that anybody who tried to do it fast would not do it at all. Then she had said, almost as an afterthought, that the old laying houses behind the upper barn were still sound, that her brother had built them in 1962 out of locust posts and chestnut planks, and that they would outlast all three of them. Della had written that down, too. She had written down everything Merle said, even when it sounded like nothing, because she had learned in the army that the people who said the least tended to know the most, and because she had a suspicion, even then, that the farm was trying to tell her something through the only person who still spoke its language. The hens she bought at the auction had come off a barn floor in a contract operation 2 counties over, where they had spent their entire productive lives in an environment designed to extract eggs at the lowest possible cost per dozen. And the contract specified that at 68 weeks of age the flock would be depopulated and replaced, because the rate of lay dropped after that point and the math no longer worked. The company that owned the contract had tried to sell the spent hens to a processor for soup meat, but the processor had cut its volume that quarter, and so the birds had been trucked to the Hadley County sale on the chance of recovering trucking costs, and when no commercial buyer appeared, they had been ready to write the whole load off as a loss. That was the lot Della bought for $15. She loaded the crates into the bed of her pickup with the help of a teenage boy named Caleb Pruitt, who worked weekends at the fairgrounds for cash, and who asked her, as they slid the last crate in, what she planned to do with 300 half-bald chickens. She told him she planned to let them rest. He looked at her like she had answered in a foreign language, and she gave him $10 out of her wallet for his help, and she drove the long way home up the ridge road so the truck would not jolt the birds more than necessary. At the farm, she did not unload them into the old laying houses right away. She set the crates in a row in the shade of the upper barn, opened the doors, and walked away. She wanted to see which ones came out on their own and which ones did not. Merle watched from the doorway of her double-wide with her arms folded and did not say anything, which Della had learned to read as approval. By dusk, about 240 of the hens had walked out into the grass, blinking, scratching tentatively, finding the dust under the elderberry bushes, and lowering themselves into it with the slow recognition of an instinct they had not been allowed to practice. The other 60 were still in the crates. Della went to each crate in the failing light and lifted those hens out one at a time, by hand, and set them in the grass herself, and she spoke to none of them, and she counted as she went. Of those 60, 11 were dead by morning. The other 49 were alive, which was 49 more than anyone at the auction would have predicted. The first month was a study in what a body remembers when it is finally allowed to. Della had read in the weeks between the funeral and her separation date every book on poultry the base library could pull for her through interlibrary loan. And she had read her grandfather's old farm ledgers cover to cover, the brown cloth-bound ones he had kept from 1958 until the year his hands got too unsteady to write. The ledgers were full of small notations about feed mixes and laying rates, and the dates eggs were sold and to whom, and at the back of the 1971 volume, in a different ink, there was a page headed simply Notes on Recovery, in which her grandfather had written down what he did when he took on hens other farmers had given up on, which apparently he had done more than once. The notes were not sentimental. They were practical. Whole oats soaked overnight, free range on rotated pasture, no more than 50 birds to the acre, buttermilk in the water for the first 10 days, no artificial light, calcium offered separately, not mixed into feed, quiet handling, the same person every day, no dogs. He had underlined no dogs. Della followed the notes as if they were orders. She mixed the feed herself in a metal trough behind the upper barn, soaking the oats in 5-gallon buckets the night before, stirring in cracked corn and a little sunflower seed and the trace minerals she ordered from a co-op in Kentucky. She moved the hens onto a fresh quarter-acre of pasture every 4 days. Using lightweight fencing she set and reset by herself, and she carried the water in 2 buckets at a time from the spring house because the line to the upper field had cracked some winter, and her grandfather had never fixed it. The first 10 days the hens laid almost nothing, maybe 4 eggs a day from 300 birds, and most of those were soft-shelled and useless. Merle came up to the upper field on the 4th day and stood at the fence for a while, and finally said that they looked like prisoners learning to walk, and Della said that was about right. And Merle nodded once and walked back down the hill without saying anything else. By the end of the 2nd week, the hens were laying about 30 eggs a day. By the end of the 3rd week, 60. The shells were still thin, the yolk still pale, but the rate was climbing in a curve that matched almost exactly a small penciled graph at the bottom of one of her grandfather's pages. Della took to checking the curve against the graph every evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and she did not allow herself to be pleased about it, because the people in town were still saying what they were saying, and she knew that the only answer to what they were saying was time. What they were saying was various, but it amounted to the same thing. At the feed store in Mercer, where Della went every other week for grit and oyster shell and the few supplements she did not mix herself, a man named Hollis Carver, who farmed 600 acres of corn and soybeans on the flat ground out past the river, and who considered himself, with some justification, the person whose opinion on agriculture mattered most in the county, had taken it upon himself to explain to anyone who would listen that what the Reyes girl was doing was the kind of thing that sounded charming until you ran the numbers. He had run the numbers, he said. Spent hens did not come back. They might lay a few eggs out of stubbornness, but the feed conversion was ruined, the shell quality was gone, and you could not sell an egg from a 68-week-old hen for enough to cover what it cost to keep her alive. He said this in the feed store, and he said it at the gas station, and he said it at the diner that had reopened that summer under new management, and he said it not unkindly, but the way a man says a fact he considers obvious, which is the most damaging way a thing can be said. The first time Della overheard him, she was standing 2 aisles over with a 50-pound bag of oyster shell on her shoulder, and he had not seen her, and she had walked past him to the counter without slowing down. She paid for her shell. She nodded at the clerk. She drove home. That night she wrote in her notebook, in the same even handwriting, the single sentence, "Hollis Carver says this leads to nothing," and she dated it, and she closed the book and put it on the shelf above the kitchen table where her grandfather had kept his. She did not write a response. The response was going to be the birds. By the 2nd month, which was December, and which came in cold with the kind of damp that gets into the joints of an old house, the flock had stabilized. Of the 289 hens that had survived the first 30 days, 271 were still alive and laying, and they were laying, on average, 180 eggs a day, which was nowhere near commercial productivity, but which was, by Della's calculation, enough to begin. The eggs were changing. The shells had thickened. The yolks had gone from the pale wash of caged production to a deep orange that surprised her the first time she cracked one into a pan, even though she had read about it and expected it. They tasted different. She had not understood, until she ate one of her own eggs, scrambled with butter in her grandfather's iron skillet, how completely different an egg could taste from another egg. She made a 2nd one to be sure. She made a 3rd for Merle, who came over for breakfast on Sundays, and who ate the egg without comment, and then, when she was finished, set down her fork and said, "Those are the ones." Della asked her what she meant. Merle said, "Those are the ones I remember." Then she got up and washed her own plate and walked back across the yard to her double wide, and Della stood at the sink for a long time afterward, holding the skillet, because she understood that her great-aunt had just told her something she would not say twice. She drove into town that afternoon with 24 eggs in a cardboard carton on the passenger seat, and she took them to the diner, the one that had reopened under new management, which was run now by a woman named Joelle Pickard, who had cooked in Asheville for 9 years before coming home to take care of her mother. Della had gone to high school with Joelle's younger sister. She set the cartons on the counter and said only that she had brought some eggs, and Joelle, who was a person of considerable directness, cracked one into a small white bowl right there at the counter and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked up at Della and asked how many she could get every week. Della said she did not know yet. Joelle said she would take whatever Della had every week, starting now, and she would pay $6 a dozen, which was nearly 3 times what the grocery store charged for the eggs in its cooler, and she would not negotiate that price down even if Della wanted her to, because she knew what she was looking at. Della said all right. Joelle wrote her a check for the 2 dozen on the spot, $12, and she handed it across the counter and said, "The next time you come in the back." Della took the check. She drove home. She did not cash it for 3 weeks because she wanted to look at it on the kitchen table and remember what the first one had felt like. January came hard and stayed hard, and Della learned that winter on a hill farm with 300 birds was a different proposition than winter anywhere else she had ever lived. The water lines froze. The hens crowded into the old laying houses her great-uncle had built in 1962 out of locust and chestnut, and the houses held the way Merle had said they would, though Della spent 2 weekends in December retarring the roofs and replacing a few rotted floorboards she could pry up with a flat bar. She rigged a system of insulated waterers using stock tank heaters and old extension cords run from the barn, and she checked them 3 times a day, because if the water froze, the laying stopped, and if the laying stopped, the slow climb she had built over 2 months would slide back down again. She lost 4 more hens in January, 2 to a hawk that took them out of the snow in broad daylight, 2 to age that finally caught up with them despite everything. She buried them at the edge of the woods without ceremony. She kept laying records in the same notebook, 1 page per week, and the numbers held steady at about 200 eggs a day through the worst of the cold, which surprised her because she had expected a drop. Joelle at the diner took 14 dozen a week and paid for them in cash now, because she had decided the check writing was slowing things down. The diner had begun listing the eggs on the menu by name, calling them Polecat Hollow eggs, which Della had not asked her to do, and which she had not objected to either. And the breakfast plate at the diner had developed a small reputation. People came in from Mercer, from Asheboro, from as far as Boone on weekends, because somebody had told somebody that the eggs at Joelle's were not like other eggs, and they wanted to see if it was true. By the 3rd week of January, Joelle was asking for 20 dozen, and by the 1st week of February, 25, and Della, who had been keeping a little back for herself and for Merle, and for the handful of neighbors who had started knocking on her door with empty cartons in their hands, realized she was going to have to make a decision about scale. And she realized also that she was not going to make it the way Hollis Carver would have made it. She was going to make it the way her grandfather had made it, which was slowly and without debt, and only when the birds themselves told her it was time. The birds told her it was time in March. She had begun, in February, to set aside the best eggs from the best hens in a small incubator she had bought used from a man up in Watauga County for $60. And on the first warm day of March, 21 days after she had set the first batch, 41 chicks hatched in a cardboard box under a heat lamp in the corner of the kitchen. She watched them dry off and stand up and begin to peep, and she did not name them, because she had decided early on that she was not going to be a person who named her birds, and she held that line, though she almost did not hold it with one chick that was smaller than the others, and that kept tipping over and getting back up. She set the chicks up in a brooder in the barn and started a second batch in the incubator that same afternoon. By April, she had 112 pullets coming along behind the original flock, and by May she had 300, and the old hens, the ones she had bought for $15, were laying so steadily that Joelle had begun supplying eggs to 2 restaurants in Boone that had heard about them from a customer, and a baker in Asheville was driving down once a week in a hatchback to buy 6 dozen at a time for a pastry program she ran out of a converted gas station. The baker, whose name was Imogene Atwell and who had grown up in Mercer and gone away to culinary school in Charleston before coming back to be near her father, told Della on her second visit that the eggs were the best she had worked with in 15 years of professional baking, and that she would buy every dozen Della could spare. Della said she could not spare many yet. Imogene said she would take what she could get and wait for the rest. She paid $8 a dozen and did not flinch when Della named the price, because she had already done the math in her own kitchen, where the eggs made her custard set differently and her cakes rise higher and her pasta dough turn the color of marigolds, and she knew that what she was buying could not be sourced at any price from a supplier she would find in a catalog. She left her card on the kitchen table the first time she came, and she came back every Thursday after that, rain or shine. And she and Della talked sometimes for an hour on the porch about flour and butter and the small particular things that separate work that is good from work that is merely competent. Merle would come out of her double wide on those Thursdays and sit in the third chair on the porch and listen mostly and say very little. And once, after Imogene had driven away, she told Della that the baker reminded her of a woman she had known in 1958, and she did not say anything more about it, and Della did not ask, because she had learned by then that Merle's references to the past were offered like seeds and not like explanations. By June, Della had a small problem of the kind she had hoped to have, which was that demand had outrun supply, and she had to decide what to do about it. The pullets from the March hatch would not begin laying until late August at the earliest, and the original flock, though steady, was not going to lay any faster than it already was. Joelle wanted 30 dozen a week. Imogene wanted 12. The 2 restaurants in Boone wanted 10 between them. A woman who ran a farmer's market booth in Wilkesboro had called twice asking if Della would consider supplying her with whatever was left over, and the answer, for the moment, was that there was nothing left over. Della sat at the kitchen table one Sunday evening with her notebook and a pencil, and she did the arithmetic 3 different ways, and each way it came out the same, which was that she could meet current demand and a little growth if she got the new pullets onto pasture on schedule and added another 200 birds in the fall, and that she could not go any faster than that without compromising what she was doing, which was the only thing she had to sell. She wrote at the bottom of the page, "Slow is the product," and she underlined it once. Then she drove to the feed store in Mercer the next morning to pick up oyster shell, because she had run low, and Hollis Carver was at the counter paying for a pallet of soybean inoculant, and he turned when he heard her come in. He had not spoken to her directly since the auction in October. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried in the small store, that he had eaten breakfast at Joelle's on Saturday, and that he understood now what the fuss was about. Della said nothing. He said that he had been wrong about the hens, and that he had been wrong about her, and that he was not going to make a large production out of saying so, but he wanted her to know it. Then he said that if she ever needed pasture, he had a 40-acre piece on the south side of the river that had been in hay for 9 years, and that she could run birds on it for nothing, because the ground could use the manure, and he had no other use for it that summer. Della looked at him for a beat. She said that was kind, and that she would think about it, and that she would let him know. He nodded once and picked up his receipt and walked out, and the clerk behind the counter A man named Eddie, who had known Hollis since they were boys, looked at Della with an expression somewhere between astonishment and something close to satisfaction, and he rang up her oyster shell without saying a word. She did not take Hollis up on the pasture that summer, not because she did not appreciate the offer, but because she had decided that the farm would grow at the speed the farm could grow at, and renting or borrowing more ground would have meant scaling faster than her labor and her attention could keep up with. She wrote Hollis a short note on a piece of lined paper a week later and mailed it to his post office box, thanking him for the offer and explaining in 2 sentences why she would not be taking it yet, but that she might revisit it in a year if the second hatch went well. He did not write back, but the following Tuesday a load of cracked corn she had ordered from the co-op was delivered to her gate, and when she went to pay for it, she discovered that someone had already paid the bill. And when she called the co-op office to ask who, the woman on the phone said only that the customer had asked not to be named, and Della understood, and she did not push. She wrote in her notebook that evening, Hollis Carver paid for the corn, and she dated it, and she did not write anything else about it. But she did, later that week, drive past his farm on the river road on her way back from town, and she slowed down a little and she looked at his fields, and she felt for the first time since she had come home something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled. July was the month Merle began to slow down. It was not dramatic and it was not sudden, and Della was not even sure at first that she was seeing it. Merle had always moved at her own pace, and her own pace had always been deliberate, and the difference between deliberate and slow can be hard to read in a person who has been the same for as long as you have known her. But Della noticed that her great-aunt was sitting down more often on the porch, that she was making the walk to the upper field less frequently, that she had begun to ask Della to bring her the mail from the box at the road instead of walking down for it herself. Merle was 82 that summer. She did not complain, and she did not announce anything, and when Della asked her one evening, gently, if she was feeling all right, Merle said that she was feeling exactly the way an 82-year-old woman ought to feel, and that Della should not waste her worry on a thing that was running on schedule. Della did not press her, but she started, without saying so, to do small things differently. She brought Merle's groceries home with her own. She fixed the loose step on the double-wide porch one Saturday afternoon without mentioning it. She made sure the wood box was full before the first cold snap of September, and she stacked the wood close enough to the door that Merle would not have to step out into weather to get to it. Merle saw all of this, of course, because Merle saw everything, and she did not thank Della for any of it, because thanks would have implied that she needed the help, and Merle was not going to imply that. But one evening in late September, sitting on the porch with a cup of decaf coffee in her hand, watching the light go down behind the ridge, Merle said, without looking at Della, that the farm had been waiting for somebody who would listen to it, and that she had wondered, for a long time, whether anybody in the family was going to. Then she said that she was glad it had been Della. Then she stood up and walked back to her double-wide, and she did not look back, and Della sat on the porch for another hour after she had gone, and she did not cry, but she sat very still, because she understood that her great-aunt had just given her something she would not give twice either. The second hatch came in October, almost a year to the day after the auction. Della set 200 eggs in the incubator over 2 staggered batches, and she got 171 chicks out of them, which was a hatch rate she had not expected, and which Merle, when she heard the number, said meant the breeding birds had finally come fully into themselves. The original flock, the hens Della had bought for $15, were entering their second year on the pasture, and their lay rate had dropped slightly, as she had known it would, but the eggs they were producing were now of a quality she could not have manufactured on purpose. The shells thick and faintly speckled, the yolks so deep they were almost red, the whites standing up in the pan in 2 distinct heights when she cracked one fresh. She had begun, in September, to keep a small notebook just for the eggs themselves, recording the dates and the conditions and the small variations in color and size, because she had realized that what she was doing was not really raising chickens, but cultivating, year by year, a particular relationship between a particular piece of ground and a particular line of birds, and that the eggs were the visible record of that relationship, and that the record was going to take decades to write properly, and that she was, at 24 years old, only at the beginning of it. She wrote that down in the notebook one night, and then she crossed it out, because she had decided she was not going to write things in the notebook that were not measurements, and the thought she had just written down was not a measurement. But she remembered it anyway. She remembered everything. By November, a year after the auction, Della was supplying eggs to 4 restaurants, 2 bakeries, the diner in Mercer, and a small specialty grocery in Boone that had begun stocking them at $9 a dozen and selling out within 3 hours of every delivery. She had stopped, at Joelle's suggestion, taking on any new accounts, because the demand had organized itself into a steady weekly rhythm she could just barely meet, and she had learned, from her grandfather's ledgers and from her own arithmetic, that the farm worked best when it was not stretched. She had paid off the small loan she had taken in March for a new water line and a proper brooder building, and she had put aside enough money to cover feed through the winter, and she had bought herself a pair of insulated boots that actually fit, and a new battery for the truck, and a wool coat at the thrift store in Mercer that she liked because it had pockets deep enough for a thermos. She had not bought anything else. She had not put a sign at the end of the driveway. She had not made a website. People found her through Joelle and through Imogene, and through the simple, persistent mechanism of one person telling another person about an egg that had surprised them at breakfast, and that was the only marketing she had ever done or intended to do. The pullets from the March hatch were laying steadily now. The pullets from the October hatch were in the brooder building and would come on in the spring, and the farm, for the first time since her grandfather had died, felt like a thing that was running rather than a thing that was being assembled. Merle died in the first week of December, 2 days after the first real snow of the year. She died in her sleep, in her double wide, with the wood stove still warm and the cat on the foot of the bed, and Della found her in the morning when she went over to check on her, because Merle had not come out for her usual walk to the mailbox by 9, and that was not like her. Della sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she called anyone. She held Merle's hand, which was already cool, and she looked at her great-aunt's face, which was as composed in death as it had been in life, and she said, out loud, the only thing she could think of to say, which was thank you. And then she sat for a while longer, and then she got up and made the necessary phone calls. The funeral was small. There were 11 people at the graveside, including Della and her mother, who had flown in from Tulsa, and Della's brother, who had driven up from Charlotte, and Joelle, and Imogene, and Hollis Carver, who Della had not invited, but who came anyway, and who stood at the back in a dark coat and did not speak to anyone and left before the service was over. Merle was buried next to her husband and next to her brother, Della's grandfather, in the small family plot at the top of the hill behind the farm, where the wind came across the ridge in winter, and where in summer you could see the whole hollow laid out below. Della stood at the grave after everyone else had gone, and she did not cry then either, because she had cried already, alone, in the kitchen the night Merle had died, and she had decided that the public part of the grief was going to be quiet, the way Merle herself had been quiet, and that the long part of the grief was going to be the work, which she was going to keep doing, and which was going to be the only monument that mattered. In the spring, Della found in a drawer in Merle's double wide, while she was sorting through her great-aunt's things, a small envelope with her own name on it in Merle's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of lined paper, folded once, and on the paper Merle had written, in her careful slanted hand, a list of every hen breed she had ever kept on the farm, going back to 1958, with notes beside each breed about temperament and lay rate and how the birds had wintered and what kind of ground they had preferred. At the bottom of the list, in different ink, Merle had written a single sentence which read, The ones you have now are the ones we were trying to get back to, and she had signed it with her initials, and she had dated it the previous July, which meant she had written it almost 6 months before she died, and had kept it in the drawer, and had never mentioned it. Della read the sentence 3 times. Then she folded the paper and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the drawer of the kitchen table where her grandfather's ledgers were. And she went outside and walked up to the upper field, where the hens were dust bathing in the new grass under the elderberry bushes, and she stood at the fence for a long time and watched them. And she did not say anything, because there was no one to say anything to, but she understood, in a way she had not understood before, that what she had taken to be a $15 gamble at a livestock auction had in fact been the closing of a circle that had been open in her family for more than 60 years, and that her great-aunt had recognized that circle closing on the morning Della had brought the first plate of eggs across the yard and had not told her, because telling her would have changed the shape of the thing, and Merle had understood better than anyone that some things have to be allowed to arrive at their own meaning in their own time. The farm went on. The second spring brought a third hatch, the third spring brought a fourth, and by the 4th year after the auction, Della had a laying flock of just over 600 birds, which was the size she had decided, after long consideration, was the right size for the ground and for one person's attention, and she did not intend to grow beyond it. She had hired Caleb Pruitt, the teenage boy from the fairgrounds, part-time on weekends and full-time in the summers, and he had turned out to be a steady worker who asked good questions and who, after 2 years, had begun keeping his own small flock at his parents' place down the road with eggs and a starter coop Della had given him as a wedding present when he married his high school girlfriend the spring he turned 20. Hollis Carver had become, in his own undemonstrative way, something like a friend, and he stopped by the farm 2 or 3 times a year to look at the birds and to drink coffee on the porch and to argue gently with Della about whether she ought to consider expanding onto his river bottom, which she still had not done and still did not intend to. Joel's Diner had grown into a small institution that drew people from 3 states, and Imogene had opened a second bakery in Boone, and the eggs from Polecat Hollow Road were now spoken of, in the kind of food magazines Della did not read, as among the finest in the southeastern United States, which was a designation she found mildly amusing, and which she did not put on any sign because she still did not have a sign. The original hens, the ones she had bought for $15, were mostly gone by then, having lived out their lives on the pasture and died, one by one, of the things that eventually take chickens, and she had buried each of them at the edge of the woods, and she had not named any of them, and she had almost not named any of them, and there had been one, a small Rhode Island red with a crooked comb, who had been one of the 49 she had pulled out of the crates by hand on the first night, who had lived longer than any of the others, almost 4 years past the auction, and who Della had, in the privacy of her own thoughts, called the old girl, though she had never said it out loud, and who she had buried last, on a cold morning in February, with more care than she had used for any of the others, in a spot under the elderberry where the hen had liked to dust bathe. 4 years after the auction, on a morning in October that had the same damp October air as the morning the story began, Della stood at the edge of the upper field with a cup of coffee in her hand and watched a new batch of pullets come out of the laying house into the grass for the first time. They were the great-great-granddaughters, by her count, of the original 300, bred from the best of every generation, raised on the same pasture, fed the same soaked oats, watered from the same spring. The light was coming up over the ridge the way it had come up over the ridge for as long as there had been a ridge, and the birds were finding the dust under the elderberry the way birds had been finding it for 60 years on that piece of ground, and Della stood and watched them and did not move and did not speak, the way she had stood and watched the first crates open 4 years earlier, and the only difference was that now she knew what she was looking at, and now there was no one laughing, and now the only sound was the small, contented sound of 300 hens settling into a morning that belonged to them. She finished her coffee. She walked back down the hill to the house, She picked up her notebook from the kitchen table, and she wrote, in the same even small handwriting, the date and the count and the weather. And then she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf above the table where her grandfather's ledgers stood, and she went out to start the day's work, because the day's work was waiting, and because the day's work, she had come to understand, was the whole point, and had been from the beginning, and would be until she was as old as Merle had been. And after that, it would be somebody else's work, and the farm would go on. The way it had gone on before her, the way it would go on after her, the way the good ground always does when somebody is patient enough to listen to what it is trying to say. If this story moved you tonight, share it with someone in your life who has been told that what they have, or what they are, or what they are building is not worth much, because those are the people who most need to hear that worth has a way of proving itself when nobody is watching. And tell me in the comments about a time you saw value in something other people had written off, and tell me where you are watching from tonight, because I want to know the shape of the map we are gathered on. And I will read every comment, every single one, the way Della read every line of her grandfather's ledgers, slowly and with attention, and with the understanding that the small things written down patiently are how the larger things eventually come to be known.